This is the saga of the Phoenix King, a tale of rebel lion, war, and the enduring spirit of a kingdom reborn. It all begins in Assyria, a land steeped in tradition but choked by the iron fist of King Gareth. Danladeen, a young man of humble origins, stumbles upon a hidden truth: he is the rightful heir to the throne. Thrust into a rebel lion led by the fiery Anya and the crimson phoenix, Danladeen must confront his destiny. As the flames of revolution engulf Assyria, an ancient scroll reveals the legend of the Phoenix King, a symbol of hope and rebirth. But the path to claiming the throne is fraught with danger. Danladeen faces not only the ruthless King Gareth, but also the whispers of doubt within his own heart. This is not just a fight for power, but a desperate struggle for the soul of a nation. Will Danladeen embrace his destiny and become the Phoenix King Assyria needs? Or will the kingdom crumble under the weight of tyranny? Enjoy this thrilling adventure, a world of magic, betrayal, and the unwavering power of hope. Witness the rise of the Phoenix King, a legend forged in the fires of war, and discover the true meaning of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The Legend of Phoenix, written and published by the Zillion Pro, Chapter 1. A tapestry depicting a phoenix rising from the ashes adorned the birthing chamber walls. Queen Anya of Assyria, her ebony hair plastered to her brow with sweat, clung desperately to the silken sheets. King Gareth, his normally stoic face etched with worry, paced the opulent chamber, his jeweled crown seeming to weigh heavier than usual. The rhythmic chanting of midwives filled the air, a desperate counterpoint to the queen's pained gasps. The night was alive with an unsettling frenzy. A relentless wind howled outside, whipping at the palace walls like a banshee's wail. Inside, flickering flames cast grotesque shadows on the golden birthing basin. Suddenly, a triumphant cry pierced the tension. A healthy baby boy emerged, his tiny lungs filling the room with a powerful scream. Relief washed over Gareth's face, momentarily erasing the worry lines etched by months of anticipation. He rushed to Anya's side, his hand reaching for hers. "A son, my love," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A prince to inherit the throne of Assyria." Anya, weak but radiant, smiled. "Our little phoenix," she murmured, her eyes gazing upon the squirming babe, his skin as fair as moonlight. But the moment of joy was shattered in an instant. A gust of wind, seemingly defying the closed windows, extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. In the blink of an eye, a chilling voice, laced with dark magic, echoed through the room. "A worthy sacrifice for the one who waits." Panic erupted. The midwife screamed, scrambling for the fallen oil lamps. Gareth, drawing his sword, spun towards the source of the voice, but saw nothing but swirling shadows. He lunged for the cradle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The cradle was empty. The wind howled with renewed fury, as if mourning the stolen light and the prince snatched from his crib. Lights flickered back on, revealing the horrifying truth. The window leading to the palace balcony, secured from the inside by a complex system of locks, stood wide open. Anya's scream, raw and primal, ripped through the chamber. Gareth, his face contorted in rage and grief, roared for the guards. Chaos descended. Guards flooded the room, their panicked shouts echoing through the opulent halls. A frantic search ensued. Every corner of the palace was scoured, the royal gardens combed by torchlight. But the thief, cloaked in darkness and aided by malevolent magic, had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no witnesses, nothing but a chilling silence that spoke of a meticulously planned abduction. Days bled into weeks, then months. The vibrant banners that once proclaimed the birth of a prince now hung limp, a constant reminder of the gaping hole in the royal family. Queen Anya, a shell of her former self, retreated into a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. King Gareth, his once jovial demeanor replaced by a steely resolve, poured every resource into finding his son. Yet, the investigation yielded nothing but dead ends and whispers of a dark sorcerer who trafficked in stolen souls. The kingdom, once abuzz with the joy of a newborn heir, was shrouded in despair. The legend of the stolen prince, whispered on the wind, became a haunting lullaby, sung to the rhythm of a broken kingdom waiting for its lost heir to return. Chapter 2. Nestled amidst the rolling hills, far from the opulent palace of Ethelred, lay the village of Anya's Hope. Named after the late queen's famed compassion, it was a community of simple folk, their lives a tapestry woven from the threads of hard work and quiet contentment. Here, amidst the rustic charm of weathered cottages and fertile fields, lived Tobias and Anya, a childless couple yearning for the patter of tiny feet. One crisp autumn morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, Tobias emerged from his humble abode to greet the day. A chill nipped at his nose, but the air carried the sweet promise of a bountiful harvest. As he rounded the corner of his cottage, he stumbled back in surprise. On his doorstep, nestled amidst the fallen leaves, lay a woven basket. Curiosity tugging at him, Tobias knelt and cautiously lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloths, lay a wailing baby boy. His skin, though slightly tanned from the journey, held the faintest hint of nobility in its smooth complexion. A shock of dark hair framed a face creased with a hungry cry. Tobias glanced around, searching for any sign of who might have left the child. But the only witnesses were the curious sparrows chirping from the nearby oak tree. Anya, alerted by the commotion, rushed out, her face etched with concern. "What is it, Tobias?" she asked, her voice laced with apprehension. Tobias, his heart swelling with a mix of surprise and tenderness, gently held out the basket. "Look, Anya," he whispered, a tremor of emotion in his voice. Anya gasped. The sight of the helpless child tugged at her maternal instincts, igniting a fierce protectiveness in her heart. She scooped the baby into her arms, his cries subsiding as she cradled him close. "He's no older than a few days," Anya murmured, tracing a finger along the baby's soft cheek. "But where did he come from?" Tobias, shaking his head in bewilderment, offered no answer. They searched the vicinity, hoping to find someone who could shed light on the child's origin. But the village remained silent, offering no clues about the abandoned babe. Days turned into weeks. Tobias and Anya, unable to bear the thought of returning the child, decided to raise him as their own. They named him Danladeen, a name that whispered of hope and resilience. Growing up in Hilaire's hope, Danladeen knew nothing of the opulent life he might have had. He toiled alongside Tobias in the fields under the watchful gaze of the sun, his laughter echoing through the quiet valley. Anya, with a love that knew no bounds, showered him with affection, nurturing his kind heart and gentle spirit. Though their life was simple, a quiet contentment filled their days. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Danladeen. Years later, a relentless drought would grip the land, its bony fingers squeezing the life out of the once fertile fields. The harvest that year was meager, barely enough to sustain a single family. Faced with crippling debt and the threat of starvation, Tobias made a heartbreaking decision. Chapter 3. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, baking the cracked earth of the Hilaire Valley. Danladeen, his brow slick with sweat, struggled to lift a heavy sack of barley. His once vibrant laughter had been replaced by a heavy silence, reflecting the despair that gripped the land. The drought had ravaged their crops, turning fertile fields into a desolate wasteland. Tobias, his face etched with worry lines deeper than any furrow he had ever plowed, watched his son with a heavy heart. Debt collectors had arrived at their doorstep weeks ago, their cold eyes and menacing voices leaving a trail of fear in their wake. To save his family from a life of servitude, Tobias had made a deal. He would sell Danladeen's labor to the notorious obsidian mines for a single year. The news had hit Danladeen like a physical blow. Leaving Anya and Tobias, the only family he had ever known, filled him with dread. Yet, the sight of his parents, their faces gaunt with worry, had quelled his protests. He would endure anything, as long as they were safe. The journey to the mines was long and arduous. They traveled in a rickety wagon filled with other unfortunate souls destined for a fate worse than death. The air was thick with fear and despair, a stark contrast to the vibrant life Danladeen had known in Hilaire's hope. Finally, after days of bone-jarring travel, they reached their destination, a sprawling complex carved into the side of a desolate mountain. The obsidian mines, notorious for their harsh conditions and merciless overseers, loomed like a monstrous beast, swallowing the sunlight and spewing out plumes of black smoke. As they were herded off the wagon, a hulking figure emerged from the shadows. Draven, the warden of the mines, was a man whose cruelty was legendary. His shaved head and scarred face spoke of a past as brutal as the world he now ruled. He scanned Danladeen with a cold, calculating gaze before barking orders. "New recruits, strip down and get your picks. Work starts now, and it doesn't end until the bell tolls." The harsh clang of metal on metal filled the air as men, stripped of their dignity, were handed crude mining picks. Danladeen, his heart pounding in his chest, joined the line, feeling the weight of his pick more than he ever thought possible. The air inside the mines was thick with dust and the acrid scent of sweat and despair. The only light came from flickering torches, casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. Day after grueling day, Danladeen hacked away at the rock face, his muscles screaming in protest. The meager rations barely sustained him, leaving him constantly weak and hungry. But even amidst the crushing hardship, Danladeen never lost sight of his gentle spirit. He shared what little food he had with the other workers, offering a word of encouragement or a kind smile. He learned their stories, tales of families torn apart, dreams turned to dust. Their shared misery forged a bond, a silent pact of survival. One evening, as they huddled together for meager warmth after a particularly grueling day, an older man named Elias placed a weathered hand on Danladeen's shoulder. "They say you have a mark," he rasped, his voice worn thin by years of hardship. Danladeen, confused, lifted his shirt sleeve, revealing a faint birthmark on his forearm, a swirling pattern that resembled a phoenix taking flight. "I've had it since I was a babe," he said, unsure of what significance it held. Elias' eyes widened. "That mark, son," he whispered, his voice laced with awe, "it belongs to the royal family." Danladeen's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a secret buried deep within his past. A seed of doubt, planted by Elias' words, began to take root in Danladeen's heart. Could it be true? Was he more than just a farm boy from Elias' hope? Chapter 4. Elias's words echoed in Danladeen's mind like a haunting melody. The birthmark, a constant reminder of his origins, now took on a new significance. Was it mere coincidence, or did it hold the key to a forgotten past, a lineage far grander than the life he knew? Days blurred into weeks as Danladeen toiled in the obsidian mines. The back-breaking labor remained relentless, but a flicker of hope had ignited within him. He began to scrutinize his reflection in the murky water of his drinking bowl, searching for any resemblance to the royal family he might have never known. One sweltering afternoon, as Danladeen hauled a cart laden with obsidian chunks, a commotion erupted at the mine entrance. Armed men, their faces hidden behind dark hoods, stormed into the cavern, brandishing gleaming swords. The guards, caught off guard, were quickly subdued. Draven, his face contorted in rage, bellowed for answers. But the leader of the intruders, a woman with fiery red hair and eyes that glittered with defiance, silenced him with a gesture. "Men of the obsidian mines," she declared, her voice ringing through the cavern, "we are not here to harm you. You are slaves to a corrupt system, forced to toil for the benefit of a king who cares nothing for your suffering." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of miners. Danladeen, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and fear, watched intently. "We are the Crimson Phoenix," the woman continued, "and we fight for a better Assyria. We believe the rightful heir, stolen from his cradle at birth, is alive and could be the key to restoring justice to our land." A gasp escaped Danladeen's lips. The woman's words hit him like a bolt of lightning. Was she talking about him? Could the stories whispered by Elias be true? The woman's gaze swept the crowd, pausing for a moment on Danladeen. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "We believe you, young man, hold the answer. You bear the mark of royalty." Danladeen's mind reeled, fear-wrought with a newfound sense of purpose. Could it be that his place was not in the suffocating darkness of the mines, but on a far grander stage? The Crimson Phoenix leader extended a hand. "Join us, and together we can overthrow the king and restore your rightful place upon the throne." The offer was tempting. The life of a king, a life of power and influence, stood in stark contrast to the brutal existence he had known. But a part of him, the part instilled by Anya and Tobias, held him back. Was this the right path? Did he truly want to become a pawn in someone else's game? Before Danladeen could respond, Draven, enraged by the audacity of the intruders, lunged at the woman. A brutal fight ensued, the cavern echoing with the clash of steel. In the chaos, Danladeen found himself caught between the Crimson Phoenix and the mine guards. The rebels, outnumbered and outmatched, were forced to retreat. They grabbed Danladeen, dragging him towards the mine entrance. "This isn't over," the woman with fiery red hair shouted back at the pursuing guards. "We will return, and when we do, we will bring an army." Danladeen found himself pulled out of the familiar darkness of the mines and into the harsh glare of the midday sun. Fear and uncertainty gnawed at him. Had he just signed his death warrant? Or had he taken the first step towards a destiny he never knew existed? As the Crimson Phoenix rebels led him away from the obsidian mines, Danladeen knew his life would never be the same. The whispers of Rebel Lion had ignited a spark within him, a fire that could consume him or forge him into the king he never knew he could be. His journey had just begun, a journey that would lead him back to Etherid, to a kingdom waiting for its lost prince, and to a truth that could rewrite history. Chapter 5. The escape from the obsidian mines had been a blur of adrenaline and fear. Danladeen, still grappling with the revelations about his potential lineage, found himself thrust into a hidden rebel camp nestled deep within the Whispering Woods. The Crimson Phoenix, a ragtag group of farmers, scholars, and disillusioned soldiers, welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Leader Anya, a woman hardened by years of struggle but with a glint of determination in her eyes, studied Danladeen with a piercing gaze. "You have the mark," she stated, her voice low and gravelly. "But do you have the heart of a king?" Danladeen stammered, unsure how to respond. The life of a ruler, shrouded in power and intrigue, seemed a world away from the dusty fields of Ilaire's hope. Yet, a flicker of something akin to pride sparked within him. Perhaps he did carry the blood of royalty. The rebels explained their plan. King Gareth, they claimed, had grown increasingly tyrannical in his grief over his missing heir. Taxes had soared, dissent was brutally crushed, and the kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse. They believed the return of the rightful heir, a symbol of hope and renewal, could ignite a rebel lion and overthrow the corrupt king. But doubt gnawed at Danladeen. How could he, a slave with no experience in courtly matters, lead a rebel lion? What evidence did he have of his royal lineage besides a birthmark and whispers from a dying miner? Sensing his turmoil, Anya placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We will help you," she said. "We have scholars who will delve into forgotten records, searching for proof of your birthright. We have warriors who will train you in the art of combat." The next few months were a grueling yet exhilarating experience. Danladeen spent his days poring over dusty scrolls, learning about the history of Assyria and the royal lineage. He trained tirelessly with weapons, his body hardening and his skills sharpening under the watchful eyes of seasoned warriors. He learned about courtly etiquette and the art of diplomacy. Slowly, a transformation began to take place. The shy farm boy began to shed his skin, replaced by a man with a quiet confidence and a steely resolve. The rebels, impressed by his dedication and natural leadership qualities, began to see him not just as a potential king, but as a comrade in arms. One evening, as Danladeen sat by a crackling campfire, lost in thought, a cloaked figure emerged from the shadows. It was Elias, the old miner who had first revealed the significance of his birthmark. Weak and haggard, he had escaped the obsidian mines during the chaos of the rebel attack. "They hunt for you, young prince," Elias rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Spies of the king have infiltrated the Crimson Phoenix. You must leave this place, or they will destroy not just you, but the entire rebel lion." Despair threatened to engulf Danladeen. All his training, all his newfound hope, threatened to crumble. But before he could surrender to fear, Anya stepped forward. "We won't let them win," she declared, her voice ringing with defiance. "We have a plan. You, Danladeen, will infiltrate Etherid. You will find the proof of your birthright and expose the king's lies. We will follow soon after, igniting a rebel lion from within." Danladeen knew this new plan was fraught with danger. Infiltrating the heavily guarded palace was a suicide mission. But the thought of abandoning the rebels, the people who had accepted him as their leader, filled him with resolve. Taking a deep breath, Danladeen met Anya's gaze. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "For the Sake of Assyria, for the Sake of the rebel lion, and for the memory of my parents." With a heavy heart, Danladeen bid farewell to the rebels, Elias's parting words echoing in his ears, "May the Phoenix guide you, your majesty." Disguised as a traveling merchant, Danladeen embarked on the most perilous journey of his life, a journey that would lead him to the heart of a corrupted kingdom and a confrontation with the king who stole his birthright. Chapter 6. Danladeen, disguised as a traveling merchant named Derek, stood at the imposing gates of Ithari, the grand capital of Assyria. The once gleaming city now bore the scars of neglect, reflecting the discontent simmering beneath the surface. He clutched a worn leather satchel, filled not with exotic wares but with a map of the palace he had painstakingly memorized from smuggled scrolls, and a burning desire for justice. The guards, bored and listless, barely glanced at him as he approached. Years of relentless propaganda had dulled their senses, painting the king as a benevolent ruler despite the whispers of rebel lion that danced on the wind. Inside the palace walls, a different reality unfolded. Opulent halls, once vibrant with life, now felt hollow and echoing. The air hung heavy with a stifling silence punctuated only by the distant cries of a caged bird. Danladeen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, followed his map through labyrinthine corridors, his senses on high alert. He reached the royal library, a vast chamber lined with towering shelves overflowing with ancient texts. This was his first stop. Here, among the dusty scrolls and brittle parchments, lay the key to unlocking his past proof of his birthright as the missing prince. Days blurred into nights as Danladeen devoured dusty tomes, deciphering faded scripts and cryptic symbols. He delved into the royal lineage, his eyes scanning line after line for a name that mirrored his own, a birth record, a coronation ceremony, anything that solidified his claim to the throne. Disappointment gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing. Frustration threatened to consume him, but a flicker of defiance kept him going. He wouldn't let the king win. He wouldn't let the Crimson Phoenix down. One evening, as Danladeen sifted through a pile of forgotten ledgers, a soft voice startled him. A young woman, her eyes wide with surprise, stood frozen in the doorway. She was cloaked in the simple garb of a servant, but her regal bearing and piercing green eyes hinted at a higher station. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice laced with suspicion. Danladeen stammered, his carefully crafted story momentarily faltering. "Derek, at your service," he said, bowing slightly, a humble merchant seeking an audience with the king. The woman's gaze softened slightly. "The king rarely grants audiences to merchants," she said, skepticism still lingering in her voice. "What business do you have with him?" Desperate for an ally, Danladeen took a gamble. "A message," he whispered, lowering his voice. "A message from the people, about the true heir to the throne." The woman's eyes widened. She glanced around nervously, then beckoned him closer. "Follow me," she said in a hushed tone. "But be warned, what you propose is a dangerous path." Danladeen followed the woman, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. Could this be a trap? Or was this the fortuitous break he desperately needed? As they navigated the twisting corridors, the woman introduced herself as Amara, a lady-in-waiting, and confided her growing disillusionment with the king's reign. They reached a secluded balcony overlooking a moonlit courtyard. Amara, her voice barely a whisper, revealed a shocking truth. King Gareth, consumed by grief and paranoia, had fabricated the story of a stolen prince. The throne, she claimed, was rightfully his deceased elder brother's, the truth he buried along with his sibling. Danladeen's head spun. The carefully constructed narrative of the missing prince crumbled before him. But if the king had lied, where did that leave him? Was his birthmark just a cruel coincidence? Amara, sensing his turmoil, placed a comforting hand on his arm. "There may be another way," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. There might be something hidden within the royal archives, a record the king overlooked. A spark of hope ignited within Danladeen. The royal archives. It was a long shot, but it was his only lead. With Amara's help, he devised a plan, a daring infiltration of the most guarded room in the palace, a room filled with secrets that could rewrite history. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of gold, Danladeen and Amara, their faces etched with determination, embarked on a mission that could change the fate of Assyria. They were walking a tightrope, their every step fraught with danger. But for Danladeen, the stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for a throne, he was fighting for his identity, for the truth, and for the future. Chapter 7. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged parchment and forgotten knowledge. Danladeen, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs, followed Amra through the labyrinthine corridors leading to the royal archives. The flickering torchlight cast long, grotesque shadows on the damp walls, adding an air of foreboding to their clandestine mission. The archives, housed in a forbidding vault deep within the palace, were a maze of towering shelves crammed with leather-bound tomes and sealed scrolls. The air was thick with dust, a silent testament to the years these records had lain undisturbed. "The birth records are supposed to be here," Amra whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed silence. "They are meticulously documented, dating back centuries." Danladeen scanned the towering shelves, his eyes searching for a familiar inscription. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. Finding the right record, one that might not even exist, felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. Hours bled into one another as they meticulously combed through the archives. Danladeen, his muscles aching from stooping and sifting, began to lose hope. Disappointment gnawed at him, threatening to consume the flicker of determination that had fueled his journey. Just as he was about to give up, a glint of gold caught his eye. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, hidden beneath a pile of dusty ledgers, lay a small, ornately carved chest. Trembling hands lifted the lid, revealing a collection of aged scrolls tied with faded crimson ribbons. One scroll, unlike the others, emanated a faint warmth as he lifted it. A royal insignia, depicting a phoenix rising from the ashes, adorned the worn parchment. With bated breath, he unfurled the scroll. The faded script revealed a detailed account of a royal birth, the birth of a prince named Danladeen, born under the constellation of the Phoenix, bearing the same birthmark on his forearm. The date matched the year King Gareth ascended the throne, the year he claimed his nephew had been stolen. Tears welled up in Danladeen's eyes. This was it. Proof. Irrefutable evidence of his birthright, hidden away 4 years. A sob escaped his lips, a mixture of relief and grief. Amra, her face pale with shock, reached out and squeezed his hand. "It's true," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You are the heir." The weight of revelation settled upon them. Danladeen wasn't just a farm boy or a rebel pawn. He was the rightful king of Assyria. But with this newfound knowledge came a chilling realization: King Gareth would stop at nothing to protect his stolen throne. They needed a plan, a way to expose the truth and ignite the rebel lion. Leaving the archives with the incriminating scroll tucked safely within his cloak, Danladeen hatched a desperate scheme with Amra. They would use a grand court ball, a gathering of dignitaries and nobles, as their stage. Danladeen, disguised as a visiting prince from a neighboring kingdom, would confront the king and reveal his true identity. The scroll, a tangible piece of evidence, would be his weapon. Amra, using her position as a lady-in-waiting, would subtly spread the news amongst the disillusioned court members, sparking whispers of rebel lion. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. But time was running out. The Crimson Phoenix waited outside the city walls, their fate hinging on Danladeen's success. He knew the consequences of failure: imprisonment, torture, or even death. But the thought of Assyria suffering under a tyrannical king fueled his resolve. He would face the king. He would reclaim his birthright. He would be the phoenix who rose from the ashes, a symbol of hope and justice for a kingdom yearning for change. As the day of the grand ball approached, a storm brewed within the palace walls. Secrets would be unveiled, loyalties tested, and the fate of Assyria would hang in the balance. Chapter 8. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling light on the opulent ballroom of Etherid Palace. The air thrummed with music, laughter, and the hushed murmur of conversation as nobles from across Assyria mingled under the watchful eyes of King Gareth. Danladeen, disguised as Prince Kyle of the Western Kingdom of Zariah, stood at the edge of the throng, a whirlwind of nerves churning in his stomach. His disguise was meticulous: a jeweled turban adorned his head, a richly embroidered cloak draped over his borrowed finery. Amra, a silent conspirator in a simple yet elegant gown, kept a watchful eye on him, ready to signal if danger approached. Danladeen scanned the room, searching for the king. There, on a raised dais, sat King Gareth, a gaunt figure shrouded in an aura of melancholy. His eyes, devoid of their former spark, held a haunted look, the result of years spent clinging to a fabricated narrative. As the music swelled to a crescendo, the king rose, his gaze sweeping the room. Danladeen's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. With a practiced bow, Danladeen drew Amura's attention. "The king," he murmured, his voice disguised with a slight Syrian accent. "I must speak with him." Amura's eyes flickered with a hint of worry, then resolve. Nodding, she discreetly maneuvered through the crowd, leading Danladeen towards the royal dais. As they approached, the music dipped, momentarily silencing the chattering throng. All eyes turned towards them, curiosity flickering in surprised gazes. King Gareth, his brow furrowed in irritation, finally focused on Danladeen. "Prince Kyle of Assyria, I presume," the king said, his voice raspy with disuse. "An unexpected pleasure. What brings you to Ethelred?" "A desire to forge alliances," Danladeen replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And perhaps," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "to address a matter of great import, a matter that concerns the future of Assyria." The king's eyes narrowed. He gestured towards a secluded alcove shrouded in velvet curtains. "Speak freely, Prince Kyle. We shall not be disturbed." Inside the alcove, bathed in the dim glow of a single sconce, Danladeen unfurled the scroll, the weight of its revelation heavy in his hands. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice low but firm, "I believe you have something that rightfully belongs to me." The king's face contorted in confusion. Then, as Danladeen unfurled the scroll further, revealing the royal insignia and the detailed account of his birth, recognition dawned on the king's face. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by a sneer, replaced the confusion. "A clever forgery, Prince Kyle," the king scoffed. "Though an impressive one, I must admit." Danladeen met the king's gaze, his resolve hardening. "Forgery? No, Your Majesty. This is the truth, the story of my birth, hidden away 4 years. I am Danladeen, your nephew, the rightful heir to the throne." The king roared with laughter, a hollow sound that echoed eerily in the alcove. "Heir? You, a mere street urchin, claiming the throne? Absurd." But the fear in the king's eyes betrayed his bluster. Danladeen pressed on, his voice rising with each sentence. He spoke of his stolen childhood, of the harsh realities he had endured, and of the people of Assyria yearning for a just ruler. Suddenly, the sound of a commotion erupted from the ballroom. A commotion orchestrated by Amura. Whispers of a stolen prince and a hidden heir began to swirl through the crowd, fueled by dissenters Amura had subtly recruited over the past few weeks. The king's face contorted in rage. He slammed his fist against the alcove wall. "Guards," he bellowed, "seize this impostor." The sound of approaching footsteps filled the air. Danladeen knew his time was running out. He needed to act fast. With a swift movement, he grabbed the king's arm, the royal signet ring glinting on his finger. "Release the scroll, Danladeen," the king snarled, his voice laced with desperation. "And I might consider leniency." Danladeen shook his head, a defiant gleam in his eyes. "The truth cannot be hidden anymore, Your Majesty. Assyria needs its rightful king." As the guards burst into the alcove, Danladeen held the scroll aloft. "People of Assyria," he shouted, his voice ringing through. Chapter 9. Danladeen's voice echoed through the ballroom, cutting through the music and chatter like a thunderclap. "People of Assyria," he boomed, his voice filled with newfound power. "I stand before you not as Prince Kyle, but as Danladeen, your rightful king." A stunned silence descended upon the room. The nobles, caught between disbelief and intrigue, exchanged bewildered glances. The scroll, its royal insignia a beacon of truth, fluttered in Danladeen's hand. King Gareth, his face contorted in fury, bellowed at the guards. "Seize him! He's a madman!" But the guards hesitated. The whispers of rebel lion, ignited by Amura minutes earlier, had taken root. Doubt flickered in their eyes, a silent rebel lion against the king's tyranny. Seizing the opportunity, Amura stepped forward, her voice ringing with clarity. "People of Assyria," she declared, "have you not seen the years of hardship, the crushing taxes, the silencing of dissent? King Gareth has misled you for too long." Her words struck a chord. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Nobles, weary of the king's oppressive rule, began to eye each other with a newfound sense of solidarity. Just then, a commotion erupted at the palace doors. A contingent of rebels, led by the fiery-haired Anya, burst into the ballroom. The Crimson Phoenix had arrived, their crimson cloaks a symbol of defiance against the oppressive regime. Chaos erupted. The guards, caught between loyalty to the king and the growing rebel lion, faltered. Some lowered their weapons, their faces etched with conflict. Others, loyalists through and through, clashed with the rebels, the sounds of steel meeting steel echoing through the grand hall. Danladeen, caught in the maelstrom, knew he had to act. He climbed onto a nearby table, the scroll held high above his head. "People of Assyria," he shouted once more, his voice rising above the din, "lay down your arms. There is no need for further bloodshed." His words, filled with a genuine desire for peace, resonated with the crowd. The rebels, sensing his sincerity, lowered their weapons. Even some of the loyalist guards, swayed by the tide of rebel lion, reluctantly backed down. A tense silence followed, broken only by the rasping breaths of those caught in the struggle. All eyes turned towards Danladeen, the man claiming to be the rightful king. Stepping forward, Anya, the leader of the Crimson Phoenix, appraised him with a piercing gaze. "Show us proof," she demanded. "Show us you are truly the heir we seek." Danladeen unfurled the scroll, revealing the faded script and the royal insignia. "This," he declared, his voice steady, "is the record of my birth, hidden away 4 years. It bears the signet of the royal family and the mark of the phoenix." A collective gasp escaped the crowd. The mark of the phoenix, a symbol etched in the royal lineage for generations, resonated deeply. Here, in this young man with a determined glint in his eyes, they saw a flicker of hope, a chance for a new beginning. From the corner of his eye, Danladeen saw King Gareth, his face a mask of despair, reach for a concealed dagger. A surge of anger and fear coursed through him. Before anyone could react, Danladeen lunged, tackling the king to the ground. A struggle ensued, their bodies grappling on the polished marble floor. The dagger clattered to the side, the focus of the battle shifting from words to a desperate fight for power. Just as the king seemed to gain the upper hand, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was Amra. With a swift movement, she snatched the discarded dagger and pressed it against King Gareth's throat. "Stand down, your majesty," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm. "Your reign of terror ends now." Tears welled up in King Gareth's eyes. Defeat, etched in his crumpled face, mirrored the collapse of his cruel regime. Slowly, he released his grip on Danladeen, his shoulders slumping in resignation. Silence once again descended upon the ballroom. The rebel lion had won, not through bloodshed, but through the revelation of truth and the unwavering hope embodied by Danladeen. He rose to his feet, the scroll clutched tightly in his hand. The journey that began in the dusty fields of Ilaire's hope had culminated in this very moment. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces filled with uncertainty, hope, and a yearning for a better future. Chapter 10. People of Assyria, Danladeen continued, his voice echoing through the hushed ballroom. "We stand at a crossroads. The path we choose will determine the future of our kingdom. Years of tyranny have left scars, but within each of you lies the strength to rebuild." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The nobles, many of whom had benefited from King Gareth's rule, shifted uneasily. The rebels, their faces etched with the hardships they had endured, held their heads high with a newfound sense of purpose. "I stand before you not just as your king," Danladeen declared, "but as a symbol of hope. A king who understands the struggles of his people, a king who will strive for justice and equality." His words, filled with conviction, resonated with the weary crowd. Years of oppression had bred a deep hunger for change. Danladeen, with his humble beginnings and unwavering spirit, embodied that change. Anya, leader of the Crimson Phoenix, stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We, the rebels, have fought for this day," she said, her voice ringing with pride. "But the true fight lies ahead. We must rebuild Assyria, together, brick by broken brick." Her words were met with a wave of applause. The rebels, once outcasts, were now seen as the harbingers of a new dawn. The lines between the elite and the downtrodden began to blur, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. King Gareth, a dethroned figure slumped against a gilded pillar, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. His grip on power, once absolute, had crumbled in the face of truth and rebel lion. Danladeen approached the fallen king, the scroll still clutched in his hand. "You will be held accountable for your actions," he said, his voice devoid of malice. "But you will also be offered a choice to face justice or to join us in rebuilding Assyria." King Gareth stared at him, a flicker of defiance momentarily lighting up his eyes. Then, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I have caused enough damage," he rasped. "Do what you must." With a heavy heart, Danladeen ordered the king to be taken into custody. The weight of responsibility settled upon him like a heavy cloak. He was no longer just a farm boy or a rebel leader. He was King Danladeen, and the fate of Assyria rested on his shoulders. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Danladeen, with Anya and Amra by his side, set about dismantling the oppressive structures of King Gareth's reign. Unjust taxes were abolished, corrupt officials were removed from power, and forgotten freedoms were restored. The people of Assyria, initially hesitant, began to embrace the changes. The markets, once deserted, buzzed with renewed life. Laughter, a sound long suppressed, echoed through the streets. A tentative sense of hope began to blossom. However, the road to recovery was far from smooth. Loyalists of the old regime grumbled in the shadows, plotting their return. Whispers of dissent reached Danladeen's ears, whispers of those who believed a king with no royal experience was unfit to rule. Danladeen knew he needed to solidify his claim to the throne. He ordered a grand ceremony, one that would not only celebrate his coronation but also serve as a symbol of unity for a fractured kingdom. The day dawned bright and clear. The once forbidding palace gates were thrown open, welcoming the people of Assyria into its grand halls. Banners emblazoned with the phoenix emblem fluttered in the breeze, a symbol of rebirth and hope. Danladeen, adorned in simple yet regal attire, stood on the balcony overlooking a sea of faces. Amongst them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, and even a few former nobles, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. As the ceremony reached its climax, Danladeen unfurled the scroll, the one that held the key to his destiny. He raised it high, for all to see. "People of Assyria," he declared, his voice filled with emotion, "this scroll is not just a record of my birth, but a testament to a new era. An era of justice, equality, and prosperity for all." A thunderous roar of approval erupted from the crowd. The whispers of doubt were drowned out by the cheers of a people who yearned for a better future. In that moment, Danladeen, the Phoenix King, was not just crowned, but embraced by his kingdom. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but with the unwavering support of his people, the wisdom of his advisors, and the burning embers of hope flickering within him, Danladeen was ready to lead Assyria into a new dawn. Chapter 11. Months had passed since Danladeen's coronation. Assyria, slowly emerging from the shadows of King Gareth's tyranny, bore the marks of change. Markets bustled with renewed trade, rebuilding efforts were underway, and a tentative peace settled over the land. However, beneath the surface, whispers of war stirred. Rumors of a growing rebel line in the neighboring kingdom of Kalmar, fueled by a charismatic warlord named Asriel, sent shivers down Danladeen's spine. One evening, as Danladeen pored over maps and reports in his royal study, Anya, her crimson cloak a stark contrast to the pale moonlight filtering through the window, strode in. Her usually fiery demeanor was shadowed by a grim concern. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice low, "we have intercepted coded messages from Kalmar. Asriel is amassing an army, and his sights seem set on Assyria." Danladeen slammed his fist on the table, scattering parchments across the floor. "War? After all we've been through." "He claims Assyria's newfound weakness is an invitation for conquest," Anya explained, her eyes narrowed. "He sees an opportunity to expand his territory, and your lack of military experience makes us an easy target." A cold dread settled in Danladeen's stomach. He knew Anya was right. The Crimson Phoenix, once a rebel force, now formed the backbone of Assyria's meager defense. But facing a seasoned warlord like Asriel with a ragtag army felt like a death wish. "We need allies," Danladeen muttered, pacing the room. But who would trust a kingdom still rebuilding from its own ashes? Amara, who had silently observed the exchange, stepped forward. "There's a possibility," she said cautiously. "The western kingdom of Zariah has maintained a neutral stance towards Assyria. Perhaps a diplomatic mission could persuade them to offer support." Anya scoffed. "Zariah? They've always seen us as barbarians. Why would they change their minds now?" Danladeen, however, saw a glimmer of hope. "It's worth a try," he declared. "Amara, prepare a diplomatic mission to Zariah. We need to explore every possible option." Days bled into weeks. The mission to Zariah, led by Amara herself, seemed to vanish into a black hole. No word arrived, leaving Danladeen consumed by anxiety. Meanwhile, reports from the Kalmar border painted a grim picture. Azrael's army was on the move, a relentless tide of steel and fire. One starless night, a lone figure materialized in the palace gardens. It was Anya, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. She pulled out a crumpled scroll, her hand trembling. "We received a message from Amara," she rasped, her voice ragged. "Zariah will not offer military aid." But Danladeen's heart sank. He knew what was coming. But Anya continued, "They have offered a passage for you, to a hidden sanctuary deep within the Zarian mountains. They call it the Eyrie, a place of ancient knowledge and powerful magic." Danladeen stared at the scroll, his mind reeling. Fleeing his kingdom in its hour of need seemed like an act of cowardice. But what other options did he have? "What does Amara say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Anya's eyes met his, a flicker of defiance in their depths. "She says, Your Majesty, sometimes the greatest victory is not won on the battlefield." Danladeen knew Amara was right. Yet, the thought of leaving his people to face Azrael's wrath gnawed at him. He spent the next few days in a restless haze, torn between duty and a desperate hope for a solution. Finally, a decision solidified within him. He wouldn't abandon his people, but he would also explore every avenue, no matter how unconventional. He called Anya and the remaining members of the Crimson Phoenix to his chambers. "We will fight," he declared, his voice firm. "But we will also seek wisdom. We will prepare for Azrael's assault, and while we do, a small delegation will embark on a journey to the Eyrie." Anya's eyes widened in surprise, then a slow smile spread across her face. "A wise decision, Your Majesty." And so, under the cloak of darkness, a small band of warriors, including Anya and Danladeen himself, set out on a perilous journey into the unknown. They left behind a kingdom teetering on the brink of war, carrying with them the hope that the Eyrie held the key to Assyria's salvation. The fate of the Phoenix King, and indeed the entire kingdom. Chapter 12. The trek to the Eyrie was arduous. They traversed treacherous mountain passes, braved bone-chilling winds, and navigated through dense, uncharted forests teeming with unseen dangers. Anya, a skilled wilderness tracker, led the way, her senses attuned to every subtle shift in the environment. Danladeen, unaccustomed to such harsh terrain, found his muscles screaming in protest. Yet, the weight of his responsibility propelled him forward. He wasn't just the king, he was the symbol of hope for a kingdom on the brink. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon a hidden valley bathed in an ethereal glow. Lush vegetation carpeted the valley floor, and a magnificent waterfall crashed into a crystal-clear lake at its center. Nestled amongst the towering peaks, shrouded in a perpetual mist, lay an intricate network of walkways and structures carved from a strange, luminescent stone. This, they realized, was the Eyrie. As they approached, a figure emerged from the mist. Tall and slender, with eyes that shimmered like molten gold, she exuded an aura of ancient energy. This was Elara, the guardian of the Eyrie. Her voice, melodic yet filled with power, echoed through the valley. "Welcome, travelers from afar. You come seeking knowledge, but knowledge comes at a price." Danladeen, his voice hoarse from the journey, stepped forward. "We are here on behalf of Assyria, a kingdom teetering on the brink of war. We seek wisdom, guidance, anything that can help us defend ourselves against the forces of Azrael." Elara's gaze pierced through him, as if she were looking into his very soul. "The path you seek is fraught with trials," she warned. "Are you prepared to face them?" Danladeen met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "For my people, for Assyria, I am." Elara nodded, a hint of a smile gracing her lips. "Then follow me." The days that followed were a whirlwind of rigorous training and arcane knowledge. Under Elara's tutelage, Danladeen discovered a dormant power within himself, a connection to the phoenix that pulsed through his veins. He learned to harness its essence, to manipulate fire in ways he never thought possible. Anya, too, honed her skills. She delved into the ancient texts of the Eyrie, unearthing forgotten strategies and forgotten magics. The other warriors trained with Elara's disciples, learning to fight as a cohesive unit, channeling their inner strength. Weeks turned into months. The news from Assyria grew steadily grim. Asriel's army had breached the border, and the hastily assembled defenses were crumbling. Despair threatened to engulf Danladeen, but Heir's unwavering faith kept him grounded. One evening, as they sat by the shimmering lake, the reflection of the setting sun painting the water in fiery hues, Heir spoke. "You are ready, Danladeen," she declared. "The knowledge you have sought is yours. Now, you must return and face your destiny." A wave of relief and trepidation washed over him. He was no longer the farm boy who had stumbled upon a forgotten scroll. He was a king, a warrior, and a phoenix reborn. But what of the promised aid? Danladeen asked, a flicker of doubt lingering in his voice. Heir smiled enigmatically. "The Eyrie does not offer armies," she said, "but it provides tools. Tools that, when wielded wisely, can shift the tide of battle." The next morning, they stood at the precipice of the valley, bidding farewell to Heir and her disciples. A faint hum resonated in the air, a sense of anticipation swirling around them. Just as Danladeen stepped forward, Heir placed a small, intricately carved box in his palm. "Use it wisely, King Danladeen," she said. "May the phoenix guide you." With a heavy heart, Danladeen and his companions embarked on their journey back to Assyria, carrying not just renewed resolve, but a mysterious box that held the key to an uncertain future. The fate of the Phoenix King, and the kingdom he swore to protect, would be decided not on the battlefield, but in the crucible of war itself. As they descended the mountain, the faint glow of the Eyrie fading behind them, Danladeen knew their fight had just begun. The legend of the Phoenix King was about to be rewritten, its next chapter penned in fire and defiance. Chapter 13. The journey back to Assyria was fraught with a desperate urgency. Days bled into nights as they pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and the gnawing fear of what they might find upon their return. Finally, as they crested a hill overlooking the ravaged plains, their worst fears materialized. Smoke billowed from the smoldering ruins of a once proud village. Bodies, both soldiers and civilians, lay strewn across the battlefield, a grim testament to Asriel's brutality. Despair threatened to engulf Danladeen, but a fierce determination reignited within him. He wouldn't let his people suffer any further. They reached the hastily constructed fortress, the last bastion of Assyria's resistance, just as dusk settled in. Anya, her face grim, briefed him on the dire situation. Asriel's army, larger and better equipped, had laid siege to the fortress 4 weeks. Their meager defenses were crumbling, and morale amongst the troops was at an all-time low. Danladeen's arrival, however, sparked a flicker of hope. News of the king's return, along with the enigmatic box from the Eyrie, spread like wildfire. With a renewed sense of purpose, the weary soldiers rallied behind their king. The following morning, Danladeen addressed his troops. He spoke of the horrors he had witnessed, of the innocent lives lost to Asriel's greed. But more importantly, he spoke of hope, of the knowledge and the power they had acquired at the Eyrie. He then unveiled the ornately carved box. Curiosity mingled with apprehension on the soldiers' faces as he carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft velvet, lay 3 seemingly ordinary objects: a small, polished stone, a vial filled with a shimmering liquid, and a single, crimson feather. Anya, who had glimpsed the contents during their journey, stepped forward. With a knowing look at Danladeen, she began to explain. The stone, she revealed, was a conduit, capable of channeling immense magical energy. The vial contained a potent elixir, one that could enhance the soldier's strength and endurance. And the feather, a symbolic representation of the phoenix itself, held the key to a devastating spell. The revelation sent a murmur of excitement through the ranks. The prospect of wielding such power against Asriel's formidable army rekindled their fighting spirit. Danladeen, with Anya and the other warriors who had trained at the Eyrie by his side, spent the following days meticulously instructing the soldiers on how to use these newfound tools. The final night before the inevitable battle was one of tense anticipation. Soldiers huddled together, sharing stories of loved ones lost and the hope for a brighter future. Danladeen, gazing over the battlefield bathed in the pale moonlight, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He was no longer just a king, but a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky a fiery orange, the unmistakable clatter of approaching armor echoed across the plains. Asriel's army, emboldened by their perceived advantage, marched towards the fortress, their war drums beating a relentless rhythm. Danladeen, his heart pounding in his chest, drew his sword and raised it high. For Assyria, he bellowed, his voice ringing out over the battlefield. A thunderous roar echoed back from the soldiers, their voices fueled by a newfound strength and the promise of the Phoenix magic. The battle that ensued was a brutal clash of steel and magic. The soldiers of Assyria, empowered by the elixir and wielding the Phoenix's power with newfound ferocity, fought with a desperation that bordered on recklessness. Danladeen, leading the charge from the front lines, unleashed the potent fire magic that pulsed within him, turning the tide of the battle in pockets of scorching victory. But Asriel's army was vast. For every enemy soldier struck down, two more seemed to take their place. The battle raged on, a gruesome ballet of death and destruction. Just as despair began to creep back into the hearts of the defenders, Anya cried out. She had channeled the Phoenix Feather's energy, conjuring a swirling vortex of fire that ripped through the enemy ranks. The sight of it, a fiery phoenix rising from the ashes of the battlefield, instilled renewed hope and terrorized the enemy. Sensing the shift in momentum, Asriel, a hulking figure clad in black armor, charged into the fray. A fierce duel ensued between him and Danladeen. Sparks flew as steel met steel, but Danladeen, fueled by rage and the Phoenix's power, pushed Asriel back. With a final, desperate swing, Danladeen disarmed Asriel. The warlord, his face contorted in fury, lunged forward, but before he could reach Danladeen, a blinding flash erupted from the vial Anya had thrown, momentarily engulfing the battlefield in an otherworldly light. When the radiance subsided, Asriel lay sprawled on the ground, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and shock. The vial, shattered by the impact, had unleashed a potent concoction that coursed through the warlord's veins, paralyzing him. With their leader incapacitated, Asriel's army faltered. The tide of the battle, already turned by the Phoenix's magic, shifted decisively. The soldiers of Assyria, emboldened by their king's victory, pressed their advantage, driving the enemy back with renewed vigor. The remaining hours were a blur of relentless pursuit and surrender. By nightfall, the battlefield lay silent, save for the moans of the wounded and the flickering flames that danced on the wind. Chapter 14. Exhausted but victorious, Danladeen surveyed the scene. The cost of victory was heavy, countless lives lost, both civilian and soldier. Yet, as he gazed upon the faces of his surviving troops, a flicker of pride and relief warmed his heart. They had defied the odds, their resilience fueled by the hope the heir had offered. He found Anya kneeling beside the paralyzed Asriel. Her eyes, usually sparkling with defiance, were clouded with a somber reflection. "We can't keep him alive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll be a rallying point for his followers." Danladeen understood. Leaving Asriel alive was a potential threat to the fragile peace they had so dearly bought. With a heavy heart, he gave the order. The following days were devoted to burying the dead, tending to the wounded, and rebuilding what had been destroyed. The news of Asriel's defeat spread like wildfire, quelling any remaining pockets of resistance. Peace, though fragile, had finally settled upon Assyria. Danladeen, his body bearing the scars of battle, stood on the balcony of the hastily repaired palace, addressing his people. He spoke not of victory, but of the unity and strength they had rediscovered. He spoke of a new dawn for Assyria, one built not on conquest, but on compassion and progress. As he looked out at the sea of faces etched with weariness and hope, he knew his true test was just beginning. Rebuilding a kingdom was far more challenging than defending it. He needed to heal the wounds of war, rebuild trust with their former enemies, and pave the way for a lasting peace. One of the first tasks was a diplomatic mission to Assyria. Amara, who had remained in the kingdom to maintain order during the war, volunteered to lead the delegation. This time, they wouldn't be seeking military aid, but offering a hand of friendship and a chance to heal old wounds. Days turned into weeks, then months. Assyria, under Danladeen's leadership, began to heal. Trade routes were reopened, shattered communities rebuilt, and forgotten traditions revived. The phoenix, a symbol of rebirth, became a beacon of hope, its image adorning every corner of the kingdom. One evening, as Danladeen sat in his study, lost in thought, a messenger arrived bearing news. Amara had returned from Assyria, not just with a treaty of peace, but with a surprise visitor. Curiosity piqued, Danladeen hurried to the reception hall. There, his heart skipping a beat, he saw a familiar figure, a young woman with fiery red hair and a mischievous glint in her eyes. Anya. However, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, a slight frown creasing his brow, was a young man with an air of nobility. He bore a striking resemblance to Danladeen, the mark of the phoenix faintly visible on his neck. "Your Majesty," Amara announced, her voice brimming with excitement, "allow me to introduce Prince Kyle of Assyria, your long-lost brother." Danladeen stared at the man, his mind reeling. A brother? He never knew he had one. Anya, sensing his confusion, stepped forward. "During our diplomatic mission," she explained, "we discovered a hidden truth about Assyria's royal lineage. Prince Kyle, it turns out, is not just Assyrian royalty, but also your blood relative, separated from you at birth." A wave of emotions washed over Danladeen's: surprise, disbelief, a flicker of joy. He had always questioned his place in the world, his humble origins a stark contrast to the life he now led. Now, he had a family, a missing piece of his past. With a warm smile, he extended his hand towards Prince Kyle. "Welcome, brother," he said. "Assyria is your home now." And as they embraced, the Phoenix King knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Chapter 15. Years flowed like a mighty river, carving their mark on the reborn kingdom of Assyria. Under Danladeen's reign, the scars of war gradually faded. Trade flourished, fostering a sense of prosperity not seen in generations. The phoenix, once a symbol of rebel lion, now represented peace, unity, and a renewed connection to the magic that pulsed within the land. Anya, the fiery rebel leader, had become Danladeen's most trusted advisor. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, had deepened into a powerful friendship. She still led the Crimson Phoenix, but their mission had shifted from fighting for survival to protecting the peace they had so dearly earned. Prince Kyle, initially hesitant about his new home, had seamlessly integrated into Assyrian life. His Assyrian lineage proved invaluable in forging diplomatic ties between the two kingdoms. He possessed a natural charisma and a keen intellect, destined for a prominent role in Assyria's future. One crisp autumn morning, Danladeen stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the bustling marketplace. A familiar warmth bloomed in his chest, a far cry from the gnawing anxiety that had plagued him in the early days of his reign. He had not only survived, but thrived. Assyria, once teetering on the brink of collapse, was now a beacon of hope in the region. Suddenly, a young hand tugged on his cloak. He looked down to see Prince Kyle's son, a lion, a boy of 7 with fiery red hair and eyes brimming with curiosity. "Uncle Dan," a lion chirped, clutching a crudely drawn picture. "Look what I made." The picture depicted a magnificent creature, its wings outstretched, flames licking at the edges. A symbol of the phoenix, albeit a slightly wobbly one. Danladeen knelt down, a gentle smile gracing his face. "That's wonderful, a lion," he praised, taking the picture. "The phoenix looks strong and proud." "Just like you, Uncle Dan," a lion declared, his voice filled with admiration. "And just like Daddy," Danladeen chuckled. Kyle had indeed proven to be a worthy leader, his wisdom and diplomacy complementing Danladeen's fiery spirit perfectly. "Yes," Danladeen agreed, ruffling a lion's hair, "just like us all." He looked out at the bustling kingdom, his heart swelling with a deep sense of pride. Assyria, reborn from the ashes of war, had grown stronger, more resilient. The legend of the Phoenix King had become more than just a story. It was a testament to the enduring spirit of his people, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. But the future, as ever, remained shrouded in a veil of uncertainty. Whispers of unrest stirred in neighboring kingdoms, reminding them that peace was a fragile commodity. Yet, Danladeen stood tall, the Phoenix King, a symbol of hope and defiance. He knew, with unwavering certainty, that Assyria, forged in fire, would face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Danladeen couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement for the embers of the future, waiting to be fanned into flames. The legacy of the Phoenix King had just begun.